Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janda with Card Runners, and I'm here with part 3 of my small bet sizing series. Alright, so this is PO Solver, and I know not everyone watching this has seen this before, but I'll explain a little bit about it before we jump in. So, what this allows us to do is it allows us to solve pretty complex situations. So here, the situation I have, and most of the situations we're going to be analyzing today are going to have this out of position, whoopsie daisy, this out of position cold calling range, which is kind of the default PO Solver out of position cold calling range. I think it's for even against button open. This is the default calling range it uses. So it calls with like pocket sixes, pocket fives, and pocket fours 100% of the time, which is why you see it being solid yellow and it reading a 1, whereas it calls with 7-6 suited 80% of the time, and it calls with ace king suited 10% of the time, pocket aces 10% of the time. I don't really agree with ever slow playing these really strong hands, but this is the default option that it has. So it's just what we're going to stick with today. And I don't think it's a big deal to go into detail for all this pre-flop stuff. Just know, even though this is the range we're going to be using, this isn't necessarily the range that I think is best for calling in the big blind against the button open, but this is what they recommend. And here is the in position opening range we're going to be using. So this is the default buttoning opening range they recommend, I believe. And this looks about right? Like, I'm not sure exactly. 45% of hands total. And then you see some mixed strategies, right? King 7 off is open 30% of the time. Queen 2 suited 50% of the time, whereas most things are solid yellow where we're opening 100%. So these are the ranges we're going to be using. And again, these aren't the exact ranges I would recommend, but they're still pretty solid ranges, and they're not going to be a big deal for what we're analyzing today. This is the starting pot size, which is 55 chips, and the effective stacks are 975 chips. So the better way to look at this is the starting pot size is 5.5 big blinds, and the effective stacked up is 97.5 big blinds. So in other words, this is a pretty normal spot where it's like the button made a little bit bigger than a min raise, and then the small blind or the big blind called. So very normal stuff here. So what I did here, which isn't the default option, is I picked 2 bet sizes. So on the flop, we can either bet 40% of the flop, 100% of the pot, or check as the in position player. On the turn in the river, there's still only 1 bet size of 70 and 75%. So I like PO Solver a lot. It's a really cool program. And when I bought it, I bought a ton of RAM for my computer to help me run this better. But even with the ton of RAM that I bought, it's still hard to analyze situations where we're 100 big blinds deep and we're using multiple bet sizing. So in a perfect world, I would have picked 3 bet sizes on the flop, 2 or 3 bet sizes on the turn, and maybe 2 bet sizes on the river. Realistically, my computer can't solve those situations, and I want to talk about multiple boards. So there's no way realistically I could, solve 10 hands that are that complex and then talk about it. It would just take too long with my computer running too hard. And there's also a limit for what it will even try to run based on your computer specs. So I don't remember it exactly, but I think it's like if I try 3 bet sizes on the flop and 3 bet sizes on the turn, it already just won't try to run it because my computer is not capable of handling it. Okay, so pause the screen if you want and sort of look at the parameters, but the main take-home message here from what I just showed is we got 2 bet sizes on the flop. That's really what we care most about for talking about the small bets versus large bets, and we're going to be able to extrapolate what we would do on the flop, which I think is the most interesting street to talk about this, to how we play the turn in the river as well. And also, if you look at some of my old content with overbets and small bets, I'm usually focusing on the turn in the river because those are the simplest spots to analyze. So here, we're really going to analyze the flop, which I think is kind of cool. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import a new hand. So I have these 10 hands that I used for writing the new 2+2 book. So these are a couple months old, but I was analyzing multiple sizes on the flop and the turn, and these are the 10 boards that I chose to analyze. So let's go with a simpler one first. Let's start with let's do Queen 8-5 rainbow. It looks like a good one. So again, all the parameters are the same as I just said. Now we're analyzing a Queen 8-5 board. So I come over here to the browser, and right now it's the out of position. So the out of position player can either check or bet. And here, PO Solver recommends the out of position player bets 1.9% of the time. So unsurprisingly, the out of position range is much weaker than the in position range. So PO Solver is basically saying the out of position player should almost always, if not literally always, check, which is what we pretty much always see in button versus big blind situations. All right, so the big blind checks. Okay, now we get to the interesting part. So here, remember, there's multiple bet sizes. The pot's 55 chips, and we can bet either 55 chips, we can bet the pot, we can bet 22 chips, or we can check. And PO Solver thinks we should pot it 24% of the time, 40% of the pot at 23% of the time, and check it 54% of the time. So again, pause for a moment and sort of take this all in. I know I'm hitting you with a lot of information very quickly, but here it thinks the button should only be betting a little bit less than half the time, and then when it does bet, it thinks it should pot it about half the time when it bets, and bet 40% of the pot about half the time when it bets. That's probably very different than what you're used to seeing, right? Like on a Queen 8-5 board, and granted, your pre-flop ranges will be a little bit different, but on a Queen 8-5 board, you're probably used to just c-betting like 70 or 80, or some people even c-bet 100% of the time, and people have gotten better, but back in the day, it used to be like people would always half pot it, always 2/3 pot it, where that's not at all what the software is recommending here. It's recommending some really big bets here pretty often when it's only given 2 bet sizing options. All right, so now I'm about to push this button right here. And when I do, if you've never seen this stuff before, you're about to get hit with you're just going to get bombarded with information and mixed strategies like you're totally not prepared for. So before I click this button and show what PO Solver recommends it does with all of its different hand combos on the button, let's just talk a little bit more conceptually. So the board's Queen 8-5 Rainbow. I haven't looked at this board for 4 months, if I ever even looked at it in any detail. Because when I was looking at this stuff before, I was also just looking at like the aggregate data for how we use multiple bet sizes on multiple flops. So I'm not even sure I've ever really looked at this board before. But before we even click on this, like think what hands are going to make sense to bet big and what hands are going to make sense to bet small. Pause for a moment and think. Now, there's going to be a lot of mixed strategies, but I would say fundamentally, like, we bet, what are the 2 reasons for betting? It's to deny equity and make the pot bigger in case we win. Well, if we have a pretty weak hand, a good but like overall still relatively weak hand, like a pair of 5s, a pair of 7s, a pair of 8s with a weak kicker, I don't think we're going to want to bet those very big because we're going to make our opponent's range too strong too quickly. And if we were to have, let's say, Ace-5. Ace-5 to me, I think we're going to want to bet small with, because the reason to bet Ace-5 is, to make the pot bigger in case we win. So our opponent will call with some hands that will win, against that showdown that Ace-5 beats. Like we'll beat our opponent's pair of 5s, we'll beat his pocket 4s, we'll beat his pocket 3s, we'll maybe beat some Ace-high hands. So it's nice to bet Ace-5 to make the pot bigger in case we win. But one of the main reasons to bet Ace-5 is just to make 2 overcards fold. And you're still going to accomplish that with a 40% pot size bet. So I would be surprised, and I've been surprised many times before, but I would be surprised if PO Solver is really going to like betting big all that often with a hand like Ace-5. Whereas, our stronger, more vulnerable hands, like, let's say, King, Ace-Queen, pocket kings, those hands might be better to bet big with because we can afford to make our opponent's range stronger much quicker because pocket kings are still just massively ahead of the opponent's range. All right, so just... Again, I really recommend you guys pause when you watch this stuff. Kind of think what hands you think will be bet big, what hands you think will be bet small. Because now's your chance to really think about this kind of stuff before you see, before you're just bombarded with data and strategy. And then you're going to be very biased in your thinking afterwards. So again, pause for a moment and think, what do you think will be bet big? What do you think will be bet small? What do you think is going to happen with, Queen X, pocket 9s, 8X? Does the kicker with the 8 matter how big you bet? How about 5X? Pause and think. And here we go. Okay. Now, I am a fan of PO Solver. I like the program a lot, and I think I've learned a lot from it. But here is why I think it's a very difficult program, especially for new players, and why I also think, even though I think PO Solver is overall a more powerful program for trying to get answers, there's some big advantages to using some like AI like Poker Snowy, which is AI like Poker Snowy gives you some really straightforward strategy, even if it might be an oversimplification. PO Solver is actually solving stuff, but when it solves stuff, like just look at the amount of mixed strategy here. Even a hand like Queen 10, it thinks you can see the EV. I can't scroll over it with my mouse, but it's in the bottom right corner. So if you look at the Queen 10 of clubs, and the reason why I can't scroll over it with my mouse is it would then change what we're looking at. But for the queen 10 of clubs, it thinks betting 55 chips has an EV of about 63 big blinds. Betting 22 chips has an EV of about 63 big blinds. And checking has an EV of about 22 big blinds. Or sorry, 62 big blinds. So it thinks the EV is about equal. It doesn't have the exact answer, but it thinks it's very, very close to being equal between betting big, betting small, and checking, which is why you see this mixed strategy where it's emphasizing betting big a little bit more than betting small, and it's emphasizing betting much more than checking. Now, you might be wondering, well, wait a second. Why does it ever recommend checking if checking has an EV of 61.9 big blinds and betting has an EV of 62.9 big blinds? I'm not positive the answer for that, but I think it is because when you have your computer solve this stuff, you solve it up to a certain level of precision. And because I didn't solve it to like 100% precision, or I didn't solve it to like 99.99% precision, because then it would take my computer like days to solve this one hand, it gets as close as I require it to, and then it starts making its best estimations. Which, as I said, I mean, they're usually pretty good. I think it's a very valuable tool. But of course, if we really did know the EV of betting big is 62.9 big blinds, and the EV of checking is 61.9 big blinds, then we would never ever check, because checking has a lower EV. Okay, cool. So that was kind of the technical stuff. So let's jump in more to the stuff that I think matters. Okay, so one step at a time. Let's find what looks like the most pure strategies to begin with. So it looks like there's mostly a pure strategy of checking with hands like ace-jack off, ace-10 off, and ace-9 off. I'm going to scroll over to them. Boop. I like checking with these hands a lot. You've seen me talk about it a lot in other videos where when we have a hand like ace-10, when we bet, we kind of just make a lot of hands that we dominate fold. Like we might make our opponent fold ace-2, ace-3, ace-4, ace-6, ace-7. We dominate all that. We might make him fold 10-7, 10-6, 10-4. We dominate all that. If he has a hand like jack-10 or 10-9, we'll bet the flop, he'll call. The turn will usually go check-check, he'll bet the river, and we'll fold. So I think betting with ace-jack, ace-10, ace-9 is a pretty ineffective strategy. We want to just check back, keep our opponent's dominated hands in this range, and hopefully improve or win at showdown. Cool. PO Solver, which is actually solving this stuff, backs that up. Awesome. So it's supporting the theory that we've had for, a while, which is don't bet unless you can make the pot bigger in case you win effectively, or unless you can deny your opponent the ability to realize their equity effectively. Ace-jack, ace-10, ace-9, suck at that, so the bet doesn't look good. Same deal with ace-jack, ace-10, ace-9 suited, though we're seeing a little bit more bets, which makes sense. The flush draw helps out a little bit. Okay, what else looks like pure strats? Checking with 7s, 6s, 4s, 3s, and 2s. Seems fine. I think most people play poorly enough that you could go ahead and bet small with the 7s and 6s. Like, I like a small bet here. And if we look, the EV between betting small and checking, like, look in the bottom right corner of my screen. So it's the EV of betting small is 27.388 chips, and the EV of checking is 27.42 chips. Whereas the EV of betting big is 23.968 chips. So it basically thinks here, betting small and checking are likely a mixed strategy. That seems good. Whereas betting big sucks. That also seems right. When we bet big with 7s, we make our opponent's range too strong too quickly, and we're not going to win at showdown. Whereas betting small denies equity, makes the pot bigger in case we win decently effectively, so a small bet seems good to me. Checking also seems totally reasonable. The worse your opponents are, the less they're going to check raise, and the more poorly they're going to play against the bet, and then I think the more you're going to want to emphasize betting with hands that look close between betting and checking. All right, let's go back to ace-5. Where was that? Ace-5 off. Okay, ace-5 off, it's saying it's a mixed strat between betting big, betting small, and checking. Though you can see, it looks like the EV is a little bit higher with betting small than it is with betting big. So this doesn't look like a hand where you'd want to bet big, though honestly, I thought the EV gap would be larger than it is. The hands were really emphasizing a near pure strategy of betting big. So the dark red is, of course, the betting big. Aces, kings, queens, 8s, and 5s. So sets and overpairs. And then let's find the 2 pair. Where's queen 8 suited? Boom. And then hands like queen 8 suited can also be bet big. As we get into like the top pair of good kickers, king, queen, queen, jack, queen 10, it's a mix between betting big and betting small. So when I see something like this, remember, these are getting us very close to actual solutions. So here, let's take queen king. Queen king, a mixed strategy between betting big and betting small, and somehow even checking. But let's ignore the checking part for a moment. Actually, you know what? Let's just stay with king queen. So king queen, mixed strat between betting big, betting small, and checking. Well, if the software is telling me that it thinks betting 100% of the pot and 40% of the pot are comparable in EV, then that makes me think, okay, well, maybe there's even a better bet size that's in the middle, right? Like, it's pretty easy to imagine how if it says, yeah, I think betting 100% of the pot and 40% of the pot is about the same, then you go, okay, well, maybe betting in between that, like maybe betting 70% of the pot will be the most effective. Because maybe betting 100% was too big and betting 40% was too small, so we can bet 70% of the pot. Whereas if this showed us just solid dark red, like if it was just solid dark red, then that would indicate that 100% of the pot doesn't look like it is too big because it wants to just bet the max we're allowing it to bet. So on this board texture, we're seeing just mixed strategies everywhere, which is really, really common with PO Solver. But even this board is a little bit more mixed than I think it even usually is. So now I'm trying to think if there's anything else that seems interesting. So the medium pairs of eights, like here, let's jack 8, 10, 8, 9, 8. All of these, either check them or bet them small, right? And it makes total sense. It's the same thing as kind of the ace-5 concept. The hand's just not that, it wants to deny some equity and it wants to make the pot bigger in case it wins, but it can't do that effectively with a big bet. Pocket nines, the exact same deal. I would slam dunk. Against the average person I play against, I would slam dunk bet pocket nines, but I would slam dunk bet it small. So for all this stuff we're talking about, if it looks close between betting and checking, I'm usually going to recommend in reality you emphasize betting because I think that plays better against weak opponents, and most of us try to play against weak opponents. Okay. For stuff that can be like bluffs, like let's say king four of spades. Like this to me seems reasonable how you could probably bet the king four of spades big, or you could bet it small if you had multiple bet sizes here. It makes sense to want to bluff some hands big and want to bluff some hands small. Same with, I'm guessing, like a straight. Let's see if we can find the straights. Where's that? 7, 6. Why am I? Oh, here we go. 7, 6. Perfect. Bet big, bet small. They both seem good, right? A 40% pot size bet denies equity and makes the pot bigger in case we win, as is a 100% pot size bet, because the equity is so robust of the 7, 6. And I'm guessing that's going to be true for gutters too, and it is. Right up nya. Okay? So, this is probably closer to what real optimal poker looks like than my guess is Poker Snowy. But again, Poker Snowy is way quicker and way easier to interpret. I think they're both pretty useful pieces of software, and you kind of just have to see which one you like if you're sort of debating going with one. All right, so let's go a little bit faster now, and we're going to keep importing more hands. So we're going to keep noticing that pattern. Let's get a really different board. Let's get 8, 7, 2, the flush shot. That one looks cool. All right, cool. Same thing stuff as before. Browser, check, boom. So we're going to probably notice a pretty similar pattern, which is we're going to be betting big with the really strong, really vulnerable hands, and we're going to emphasize betting smaller with the hands that aren't quite as good but are still, want to deny equity and make the pot bigger. So the best place to look for that are the pairs of sevens. Pairs of sevens. Light pink means bet small, right? This is the pair of sevens. This, and then ace 7 off and king 7 off. Unsurprisingly, it's strongly emphasizing betting small with the pairs of sevens because they're only middle pair. Whereas when we get to the best pair of sevens, the ace 7, okay, now we can start entertaining the idea of maybe betting bigger too. But again, in reality, if ace 7 has a mixed strat between betting 100%, betting 40% of the pot, and then maybe even checking, I would just go, okay, well, let's not bet 100%, that seems too big, but if we can bet a little bigger than 40%, we can maybe bet, 65 or 70% of the pot. Because once we bet, we're obviously reopening up the betting and making ourselves vulnerable to getting check raised. So maybe if we bet 100% of the pot with ace 7, the bet's just too big. But if we bet only 40% of the pot with ace 7, we're reopening up the betting, but we're not putting enough money in the pot. So the best sizing might have been like 60, 65, 70% of the pot. No real way to know with absolute certainty, but that seems reasonable. As we get to the pair of eights, we start emphasizing betting bigger. Still kind of mixed between betting big and betting small with a pair of eights. Sounds good to me. They're like 10-8. It's good, not great. Sure. I would definitely bet all these hands, though. And again, I stuck with the default option for PO Solver, but I think if I were to do these hands all over again, and again, it takes me a long time to run these simulations, which is why I can't just, it's not like Snowy where I can just, close the screen, pause, set something up in 3 minutes and come back. But if I were to run these simulations all over again, I would make the big blind calling range much wider, and I'd also remove all those really nut type hands, because I really don't think the big blind should be calling with those aces, kings, or queens almost ever. So here, against the big blind stronger range, it's still checking back, like 10-8 and Jack-8, way more often than I would never ever check those hands back. And it's recommending checking them back sometimes here. As our hands get still stronger and still more vulnerable, like 10s and 9s, or I guess not more vulnerable, but stronger, 10s and 9s, we're emphasizing betting bigger. The two-pair hands, I'm guessing, are also going to emphasize betting bigger, yep, and then the sets. Cool. Obviously, I think it's a good idea to sort of pause this stuff and look around at the mixed strategies, because I can't talk about all of them, but you're going to notice the most obvious pattern is, of course, bet the better hands that are vulnerable bigger, bet the vulnerable yet not so great hands smaller, and then with draws you can usually do both, right? You can bet big, you can bet small. It makes sense when you have robust equity to do both, and both the big betting range and the small betting range are going to want to have some hands that have the potential to make the nuts. So you see that 6-5. Bet big, bet small. 5-4, bet big, bet small. And even if you take a hand like, let's say, 6-5, it's very reasonable to imagine why, in theory, you would need to bet big with it sometimes, bet small with it sometimes, and you might even need to check it back sometimes, because if you never check it back, you might be too vulnerable on like 9 turns or 4 turns when your opponent makes the straight. So I easily think a hand like 6-5 could, in reality, actually be a mixed strat between betting, checking, and then when you do bet, whether you bet big or small, all that seems reasonable. All right, so I don't really know if there's anything too much more to talk about here. The main thing that's surprising me about this board is I think it's checking back way too much. I think checking back aces and stuff is just crazy, and it's not a mixed strat. Again, I don't know if that's just due to it not. I don't know if that's due to the default option assigning the big blind too strong a range, or if it's just due to the fact that the out of position player might check raise a lot. So what we can do is we can go like this: boom, bet 22. Now let's look at the strategy for the out of position player. And the out of position player is raising 16.5% against the C-bet. So that's also something that's really cool to see. In reality, when you C-bet here, are you getting raised 16.5% of the time? Probably not even close. So what's so cool about this program is if something seems off to you, we can back it up once more. And it seemed off to me here. Like, it seemed like we were checking too many good hands. Then we can go, well, why are we checking so often? Let's see what happens when we do bet. And then PO Solver tells us, well, no, PO Solver thinks the out of position player should check raise aggressively against bets here. And then that makes the checking at a higher frequency on the flop make more sense, because it sucks badly when we see bet on the flop with, 9-8, 10-8, or even a hand like pocket jacks and we face the check raise. Okay, so let's keep looking at some more boards. File, low tree. See this one, king, queen, 8. All right, same thing as before. Browser. All right, check. Strategy. And let's just again look for that pattern. Let's look for checking or betting small with the queens. Do we see it? Yep, right here. Checking or betting small. Checking or betting small. Checking or betting small. And obviously it makes sense to emphasize checking more the weaker our queen gets. Betting more the better our queen gets. Super. It makes a ton of sense once you think it through. I don't want to say this is really intuitive, but it definitely makes sense. And then kings, we probably want to emphasize betting bigger with the good kickers. Yup. And then betting smaller with the weak kickers. Yup. So we see that pattern. Do I actually think every single king is a mixed strategy? I don't. I think if we could somehow solve this hand, like truly solve it. And keep in mind, so PO Solver, as I said, I think it's closer to actual solutions than Poker Snowy. But even PO Solver, when we're oversimplifying stuff with only 2 bet sizings, and still crazy complex the strategies it's giving us. So if we could somehow actually truly solve with every single possible bet sizing, I don't think you'd always, I think even the kings with the good kickers would use lots of different bet sizings, but overall they'd emphasize betting bigger. The kings with the weaker kicker would probably emphasize checking more or overall bet smaller. It wouldn't just be like the EV is the same no matter what you do with king 10, and the EV is the same no matter what you do with king 2, like it looks like here. because this is still technically a toy game because we've only are allowing 2 bet sizes. Okay, so let's pause for a moment and think, because we're going to keep seeing the same patterns, and I don't think it's all that useful to just be hit with a ton of data at once. If you do think that's useful, last I checked, PO Solver lets you download the turn and river solver for free. So you can do that and get hit with a ton of data and see if you like the program. And then you can buy the flop solver if you really like it, in which case you can just go ahead, jump in, explore, and look at tons of different boards and ranges and see what it recommends. But right now, I don't think that's the best use of our time. Okay, so in reality, let's imagine we opened the button and the big blind called. Okay? Now, when we're analyzing hands, we want to have a sense of what our own skill level is and what our opponent's skill level is. So a good example of this would be is if I was talking to a really new player. For a really new player, I just want them to bet when betting is correct, and for the most part, check and call when checking and calling is correct. I'm not going to be anal about bet sizing for a new player because that's too hard and it takes too long to develop that skill set. They're not there yet. We want to be reasonable with what their ability is, reasonable with what we expect. So we want to have a sense of our own skill when we talk about spots, and we also want to have a sense of our opponent's skill level. So PO Solver is going to recommend strategies against these actual optimal type opponents that are capable of all these mixed strategies and all this exploitative play and all that kind of stuff. Which is why PO Solver is recommending with this simulation that it even checks back a hand like Ace King sometimes. In reality, if anyone ever showed me a hand where they checked back Ace King on the flop, I probably think it's absolutely horrible here. If your opponents were ever so good that you couldn't that betting Ace King isn't more profitable than checking, then I think it's almost going to be impossible to beat the rake. Like it's just not a thing. If it's even possible against an optimal opponent to, occasionally need to check back Ace King because it puts this in your range and there you can't get exploited later on, blah, 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 blah. If it's even possible to ever really justify checking back Ace King, you're probably playing against too good of opponents to beat the rake. So I would hate it if I saw someone check with Ace King. In reality, if someone were to show me these hands, like all these different types of hands here, let's take a good example. Queen 7 pseudo would be a great example. Someone asked me for advice on the flop here. They open the button with Queen 7, the big blind calls, they get this flop. I'm fine with them checking on this flop, and I'm fine with them betting on this flop. Both of those seem reasonable to me. The only thing I'm not fine with is a big bet. And now here, let's look at Queen 7 of hearts. It thinks betting small has an EV of 34 chips, 34.043 chips. Checking has an EV of 34.11 chips. So the EV there is effectively the same, right? It's very, 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 very close. And then the EV, it's less than a tenth of a big blind. Sorry, it's less than a tenth of a chip. And the EV of betting 55 chips has an EV of 33 chips, which is still very, very close. So here, you're looking at this software, and it's telling you, it basically doesn't really matter what you do with Queen 7. Checking EV 34 chips, betting EV 34 chips. Sorry, betting small EV 34 chips and betting big EV 33 chips. In reality, I don't think that's going to be even close to the case. In reality, I would just ask myself, okay, we bet to deny equity and make the pot bigger in case we win. And betting big with Queen 7 on this board looks absolutely terrible to me. PO Solver, if we bet big against it, it's probably going to recommend some really crazy counter or really crazy response strategy. Right? It's going to be check. You can look here and you can see it raises all these different hands at a really small frequency, and then it has these mixed strats between raising and calling with top 2 pair, and it even has some pocket aces and pocket kings in its range. But in reality, that's not going to be the case. And against opponents that are playing very straightforward, because straightforward play is how you win money against really weak opponents. Against opponents that are playing really straightforward, a large bet on this flop with a hand like Queen 7 just seems absolutely terrible. So I absolutely would not get in the habit of playing with PO Solver and thinking, oh, there's just mixed strategies everywhere. It doesn't really matter what I do. I think that's going to open up a ton of leaks to your game. If we look right here on this board, how many hands are not a mixed strategy between all 3 options? Very few, right? And even the ones that aren't mixed strategies, let's take pocket aces. Let's see what pocket aces. Betting EV, betting big, 69.3 7 chips. Betting small, EV, 69.6 chips. Checking, EV, 69 chips. Like, the EV is all within 1 chip, and we're 1,000 chips deep. In reality, do I think the EV between whether or not you bet and how big you bet is always, like, within a thousandth of your stacked up? No, not even close. You should slam dunk bet your aces here, and checking's terrible. So I think one thing I worry about is people are going to play with PO Solver, and they're going to think, hey, it doesn't really matter what I do, the EV's the same. And again, that's only true in this sort of robot simulation world. And even then, that's pretty surprising to me. But it can kind of make sense when you think about all the counter strategies and all that jazz. What I think PO Solver is very useful for is you use it to give you an idea of what you think the best line is. So here, like, let's look at pocket nines. Okay, I'm not even going to look at the EV in the bottom right-hand corner. It says mostly check, and if it does bet, it bets only a little bit of the time, and it bets small. That sounds good to me, right? Like, I think you too should mostly check with nines here, and if you are going to bet, I think it needs to be a small bet, because betting can make the pot bigger in case your opponent calls with like an 8x hand, and it can deny your opponent the ability to realize his equity with a hand like ace-4 or with a hand like jack-7. Cool. So either check it or bet this really small. Don't bet big. I would not worry about the EV gap between betting big and betting small, because again, that's going to make you think the EV gap is a lot less than it probably is. Let's just do one more quick one to talk about conceptually. It would be the same thing with a hand like, queen 9. Either check it or bet small. And then if you had a hand like, where's a really good example? Pocket 8s. Boom, pocket 8s. Pure strategy here from PO Solver of betting. Don't check pocket 8s. But here we can see it really heavily emphasizes betting big. So to me, unless your opponent looks like he's a check raise happy kind of guy, I would go, yeah, dude, if I had pocket 8s, I would want to bet bigger here because I'm not blocking any kings from the opponent's range. My opponent can have a ton of draw, and I basically have the absolute pure nuts here. So it's just a very effective hand to bet big to make the pot big in case I win. And then, it also will deny some equity too, right? We can maybe make our opponent fold gut shots if we bet big. But more importantly, we're just going to win more money on average by betting big here because our hand's so strong and it's not blocking any kings. So I think when you're using PO Solver, you're looking for patterns, same thing as Poker Snowy, but you're looking for patterns and then you're trying to find the best way to play the hand. I wouldn't get too caught up with all these mixed strategies and the EV all being so close, because again, in reality, that's just not going to be true. There's just a huge gap in EV between betting aces and checking it, and it is not 1,000th of your stack. All right, cool. So let's just summarize. So I think this really just backed up the theories and the patterns we've already talked about in the last 2 videos, which is great because this stuff came out, PO Solver came out after all the theory came out. So it's good to see that this is supported. Not that we haven't learned a lot from PO Solver, but it's just good to see that like the basic core theory we've been talking about is supported here. All right, so that's going to conclude our video. But if you have any questions, if you have any comments, feel free to ask me them in the forums. Likewise, if you did want to see what happens after we bet small on the flop and the opponent check raises, how we defend, stuff like that, just let me know and I can look it up and I can post the screenshot to you in the forums. It's not a big deal. So let me know if you need anything like that. The other thing is, let me know if you'd like to see more videos with PO Solver. I'll probably bring it up once in a while, but I'm not planning currently on making too many PO Solver videos because I just think it's too much information all at once and it can be a little bit hard to interpret quickly. Whereas more broad concept videos are using Poker Snowy, sometimes a little bit easier to follow. But I could be wrong about that. Maybe you guys want to see all this information boom at once, whereas, Poker Snowy is usually only really telling us what to do with sometimes only one hand. So let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone. I really appreciate it, and good luck, all right? Take care.